if we follow through on the commitments that this Paris Agreement embodies, history may well judge it as a turning point for our planet.
So we're getting out. This agreement is less about the climate and more about other countries gaining a financial advantage over the United States. We don't want other leaders and other countries laughing at us anymore, and they won't be. I was elected to represent the citizens of Pittsburgh, not Paris.
President Trump in the Rose Garden today saying the U.S. is pulling out of the climate change agreement. That started a whole bunch of reaction all over the place. Here's just some of it.
The agreement says we need to reduce our carbon output by 20%, but China doesn't have to do anything for the next 20 years. How in the world could that possibly be fair?
We are going to lose millions of jobs for hardworking Americans because the president is going to honor a promise to the coal industry.
Why do we need to enter into an agreement that's very favorable to other nations and their political ambitions and their political worldview?
The president who talked about putting America first has now put America last, together with Syria, which is in the midst of a civil war, and Nicaragua, which thought the agreement didn't go far enough. He's made us an environmental pariah in the world, and I think it is one of the most self-destructive moves I've ever seen by any president in my lifetime.
Another commentator said the president resigned as the leader of the free world. So all kinds of reaction. Let's bring in our panel. Steve Hayes, editor-in-chief of the Weekly Standard. Mara Liasson, national political correspondent of National Public Radio. Molly Hemingway, senior editor at The Federalist, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Steve.
Well, the hysteria from the left on this is a good reminder that their hysteria is not just because of Donald Trump, because Donald Trump is president, but it's based on policy at times. I mean, some of the comments that you've heard, Fareed Zakaria saying the United States had resigned as leader of the free world, and Tom Steyer saying this was a traitorous act of war on the American people, suggest just how invested the left is. But there's a deep irony, I would say, in this hysteria. It is, as you've described, a non-binding, unenforceable, voluntary, non-ratified agreement. So how is it on the one hand that you can have the left crying about this meaning doom for the planet, on the other hand this not having any enforcement mechanisms?
I guess, Mara, when talking about this in the framework of how President Obama signed on to it and how much he put into that, it still wasn't a treaty. It never went to the U.S. Senate. It never got a vote. You know why? Because they would have voted it down.
They would have voted it down. But as Steve just said, the goals were voluntary and they were chosen by each country individually. So if it was toothless and it wasn't binding, what's the great harm of staying in? In other words, I think that, yes, there was hysteria on the left about getting out, but with Donald Trump, the picture he painted just doesn't comport with reality. He could have ratcheted down Obama's goals if he wanted to. He already was getting rid of all the mechanisms that was supposed to get us to the Obama goals. But this was something that every single country in the world, except for Syria, which, as John Kerry said, is in a civil war, in Nicaragua, which is going to join, even though they wanted something tougher, has agreed to. And the interesting thing is, even today, even when White House officials briefed, they could not say whether President Trump believed that human activity causes climate change or not. That is a consensus, a big, overwhelming consensus around the world.
So, Molly, get to that about the environmental leadership, American leadership, as you look at the map and the three countries, the U.S., Syria, and Nicaragua. And as Mara rightly points, Nicaragua wants it tougher, not it doesn't go tough enough.
Right, and we're talking about how it wasn't binding, but it's also true that the idea was to set up agencies within the administrative state to enforce what we had committed to under this accord, and that would have, according to analysis, cost $3 trillion in the next few decades. It would have cost more than 6 million jobs, and so not taking part in an agreement that causes a great economic damage for no environmental benefits is not a bad thing. It's actually a mark of leadership to say, why would we do this to ourselves?
The president also saying in this statement, Charles, that he is open to renegotiating this deal. Take a listen.
So if the obstructionists want to get together with me, let's make them non-obstructionists. We will all sit down and we will get back into the deal and we'll make it good, and we won't be closing up our factories and we won't be losing our jobs, and we'll sit down with the Democrats and all of the people that represent either the Paris Accord or something that we can do that's much better than the Paris Accord. And I think the people of our country will be thrilled.
Look, I don't know how sincere or realistic that is, but that's the right idea. I'm all in favor of an international treaty on climate and on controlling emission of CO2. But Paris wasn't that. That was one where it essentially said the U.S. is going to export coal industry to India and China, who don't have to do a damn thing for 20 years. And the argument of the developing countries was, well, you got 100 years head start in the Industrial Revolution. We're catching up, so we're not going to stop our development now when you already are developed. To which I would say we're not going to apologize for having invented the steam engine. We are where we are. If we're going to have controls on emissions, it's going to be equitable. You're not going to have a 20-year hiatus where the Chinese don't have to reduce anything, and the Indians are going to double their emissions from coal. So I think withdrawing, look, I didn't like the language around it that the president hurled. It'll be useful in the presidential campaign, the next presidential campaign. But withdrawing from a treaty which was toothless, except that it would have been used in our courts to enforce restrictions on us, was a good idea.
All right, Mara, let's talk about where climate change as an issue stands. If you look at Fox News polls just out, climate change concern, the time trend, this is number one, extremely or very concerned. In 2017, it's 60-40 to not very or not at all. And it is breaking now on Fox Poll 4 as far as issues that that people are concerned about: government spending, Russian meddling, economy, climate change is at 29%. Looking at what happened today, the reaction from the environmentalists, Democrats, it seems like they are always losing to the argument about jobs. And they're always losing to it, even though the issue seems to be more concerning for American people.
Well, that's because jobs is usually the #1 issue. Now there is huge consensus around climate change, and it's been growing, as you just showed. It's been growing. It's becoming one of those big consensus issues. That doesn't mean it's the #1 thing that motivates someone to vote. Donald Trump aligned himself with his base today very, very strongly. As he said, I'm representing Pittsburgh, not Paris, even though the mayor of Pittsburgh pointed out that they went for Hillary. But that, we know what he meant. He's aligning himself with his Rust Belt base. He's fulfilling a campaign promise. But the general issue of climate change, which he did not address. He talked only about jobs and the economy today. That is the #1 issue. But he didn't say what he wants the United States to do about this other than what we've already done. You heard Scott Pruitt today say we're already, making such great strides. So this is an issue. Can the Democrats somehow make the argument, as Ed Markey tried to make in that clip, that doing something about climate change will actually produce jobs because of all this green technology? But they haven't been able to do that yet.
It's also worth noting that this deal itself, according to analysis, wouldn't do anything to help out with the climate change problem. And it's one thing to say, oh, well, we intend to help out with climate change, and entirely another to actually do something. And particularly when you're asking middle Americans to support this with their jobs and with their loss of income and with extra costs applied to them, it makes no sense to have no democratic accountability.
I will just say that in that part of the speech where he went to the degree of Celsius, I mean, it is a big deal if you move the world temperature a degree. And if you talk to the scientific community.
Right, he said it was tiny, but actually it's big.
And even a portion of that, it is a big deal if you talk to scientists who are in this realm. Steve, but I want to get back to the moment. It's not just about the base, right? I mean, it's about the common sense when he says India is getting hundreds of billions of dollars and doubling their coal plants, and China doesn't have to do anything till 2030, as Charles mentioned, and yet they're a developing country as of the last agreement.
Right. No, it was literally the case that countries could set their own benchmarks for what they wanted to do, for what they would declare as success. So they could have said, if we continue along our current projections in terms of emissions, we'll count that as success. I mean, but that's crazy to think of that. I mean, that would be like me saying, well, I'm going to consider it a success in 2 years if I'm just as fat as I am now. This diet is great, but I'm still gaining weight. I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
Don't put yourself down.
Well, thanks for the buck up. Thanks for the buck up. There's other polling too, that I think builds on what you asked Mara about, that shows that climate change in terms of intensity of an issue is very small. The number of people who regard it as the most important issue, mired in the low single digits. It's just not the kind of issue that Democrats, I think, are likely to be able to move. And we've heard Democrats again and again and again say that they're going to marshal their forces to fight for climate change. It hasn't worked before. I'm skeptical that it'll work again politically.
Charles.
The left is showing that this has become an issue of almost religious belief. You could shut down every coal mine in America. The effect on the climate, on temperature, would be negligible. You couldn't even measure it. And second, if this is such a popular issue, such a consensus issue, well, when the Democrats had the White House, when Obama concluded this, why didn't he go to the Senate? We have a Constitution. There's a reason why we have provisions, because you want treaties to have substance and permanence. So you go to the Senate, you get a consensus of the country expressed by a two-thirds majority, rather than some executive agreement, like I would say the Iran deal, which they knew would not have consensus. The Kyoto Agreement was voted down by like 99-1 in the late 1990s because people didn't want it. And I think if Democrats are so attached to this and think that this is so apocalyptic if it's withdrawn from, why didn't they go to the Senate and have it inscribed as a treaty? Because they would never have gotten the vote.
Finally, I just want to play this one more soundbite from Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross, who was on Neil Cavuto's show, summing it up.
It's not that he doesn't want a climate deal. He wants a deal that's fair and a deal that doesn't cost us trillions of dollars of GDP and millions of jobs just to line the pockets of developing countries and European countries.
And it sounds like the trade deals.
Well, and this gets to the point again about the need for democratic accountability on this. We've seen globally people not appreciating even things that are good for them, like free trade deals. But when it comes to something like this, where there are so many downsides, so many costs politically and economically, and again, negligible gain for what the whole reason that we're supposed to be into this, you know, the environmental benefits, it's just not going to pass muster with the American people.
Well, the environmentalists, Mara, are not getting it done as far as...
No, I think the big question now is, can it become an issue? It's low intensity, broad support. So can they make that something different? And among young voters, now this is a very long-term project, among young voters, this is an article of faith.
So why don't Democrats demand a vote in the Senate tomorrow, if it were that popular? Why don't they? Because they're hypocrites. They know it's not going to pass.
And it's also true, I think, that this is something that is very meaningful to Donald Trump's voters. Donald Trump voters are so used to people on the right, so used to Republicans and conservatives claiming that they're going to get out of things like this. I mean, this is officially part of the Republican platform to exit the Paris Accords. And yet you had Mitt Romney, the previous presidential nominee, just yesterday begging Trump to stay in. And so it was a refreshing thing for a lot of Trump voters to see someone actually follow through with a campaign promise, as Trump did today.
It is a different president, a different administration. Panel, stand by.